All right, so today we are going to dig deep into the origins of World War I. We're going to move past the simple headlines you find in textbooks and really try to understand the complex, creaking machinery that sent the entire world down a path of utter devastation. You know, the story we're all told usually starts and ends with one gunshot in Sarajevo. But really think about it. Was the assassination of an archduke, one single event, however tragic, truly enough to cause a war that would completely redraw the map of the world and snuff out entire empires? The short answer is no way.
And that quote right there is exactly how we have to look at this. The assassination, that was just the matchstick. But Europe in 1914? It was a mountain of dynamite that had been piling up for decades. So our job today is to take a very close look at that explosive material.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the spark itself. Then we'll untangle that crazy web of alliances it set off. We're going to spend most of our time, though, on the four deeper causes, the real dynamite. We'll also explore the voices of people who are screaming for peace, and we'll finish up with a look at the bizarre family feud at the very top of it all.
Okay, let's get into the event that kicked everything off. And even though it wasn't the real cause, what's just wild is how much of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand came down to pure, dumb luck and a series of blunders.
So, get this. The initial assassination attempt, a bomb, totally fails. It just bounces off the Archduke's car. Then, the Archduke, in a moment of compassion, decides he wants to visit the people who were injured in the blast. But on the way to the hospital, his driver takes a wrong turn. And who is standing right there, probably thinking his chance was long gone? Gavrilo Princip. He's just feet away. The entire course of 20th century history changed because of a wrong turn.
But here's the thing. That gunshot echoed across a continent that was basically a tinderbox, all wired up and ready to explode. Europe was tangled in a series of interlocking treaties that were supposed to keep the peace. Instead, they created the perfect setup for a domino effect that would lead to total war.
And this so-called chain of friendship shows you just how fast it all unraveled. It was a chain reaction. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia and declares war. But wait, Russia's friends with Serbia, so they start mobilizing their army. That makes Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, declare war on Russia, which then pulls in Russia's ally, France. And the moment Germany marches through neutral Belgium to get to France, boom, Great Britain is in. It was a cascade of obligations that nobody could stop.
So why were all these dominoes lined up in the first place? That gets us to the real meat of the issue, back to that mountain of dynamite. For decades, four huge forces had been cranking up the pressure across Europe, making the continent ripe for a massive conflict. An easy way to remember them is the acronym MAIN.
Now, the key thing to get here is that none of these existed on their own. They were all feeding each other into a dangerous cycle. Militarism, this obsession with military strength, was needed to expand your empire. That's imperialism. This global competition for colonies created rivalries that then locked those alliances into place. And holding it all together was nationalism. And we're not just talking about patriotism. This was an aggressive us versus them mentality that made war seem not just acceptable, but noble.
And if you want to see militarism in action, just follow the money. In the roughly 40 years leading up to the war, the big powers in Europe quadrupled their spending on their militaries. This was a full-blown arms race. You had countries building enormous armies and navies, creating not only the weapons for a massive war, but also a powerful military class that was itching to use them.
So what was fueling this whole fire? A huge part of it was imperialism. It was this global scramble for colonies. And it wasn't just about planting a flag for national pride. It was about money. It was about exploiting new lands for raw materials and cheap labor, a system that many thinkers at the time called the highest stage of capitalism. This ruthless competition, especially in Africa and Asia, created constant friction between the empires.
So you've got these huge empires battling it out, but it would be a huge mistake to think everyone back home was cheering them on. In fact, there was a powerful, vocal opposition that saw this imperial war for exactly what it was and argued against it with everything they had.
A lot of the loudest voices against the war came from socialist and anarchist groups. See, their whole philosophy was built on internationalism. They believed that a German factory worker had way more in common with a French factory worker than with the German Kaiser. They saw the war as a rich man's fight where poor men were going to do all the dying. People like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany stood up and screamed no, a decision that would eventually cost them their lives.
And you can actually see this battle of ideas playing out in the poetry of the time. On one side, you have these romantic, pro-war poems like Rupert Brooke's, painting death on the battlefield as this beautiful, heroic sacrifice for your country. But then you have the soldier poets, men like Wilfred Owen, who came back from the horror of the trenches and wrote about what it was really like. He describes men dying like cattle, with no ceremony, only the monstrous anger of the guns. The contrast is just staggering.
But maybe nobody captured the sheer heartbreaking absurdity of it all better than Thomas Hardy. In this poem, he imagines a regular soldier thinking about the man he just killed. He calls him his foe. But then he starts to wonder, this guy was probably just like me, probably out of a job, signed up for the pay. He realizes that if they'd met anywhere else, in any bar, they probably would have bought each other a drink. Hardy just cuts right through all the flags and the propaganda to the simple, tragic truth. This was a war that made ordinary people kill other ordinary people they had absolutely no reason to hate.
And just when you think this whole thing couldn't get any more absurd, we get to the final layer of this tragedy, a layer that feels like it's straight out of a TV show. Because while ordinary men were dying in the mud, this war was, in many ways, just a massive family feud.
No, seriously, this is real. Look at this. King George V of Great Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, they were all first cousins. They all shared the same grandmother, Queen Victoria. This global catastrophe, this war that killed millions, was also a fight between Georgie, Willie, and Nicky. It's absolutely surreal.
And nothing, nothing, shows the gap between the men in charge and the men in the trenches better than the Christmas truce of 1914. All along the Western Front, British and German soldiers just stopped fighting. They climbed out of their trenches, sang carols, traded cigarettes and food. They showed each other that they had no personal hatred for the man on the other side. Of course, the generals were horrified and ordered the fighting to start again immediately.
And that, really, is what it all comes down to. When you peel back all the layers, the politics, the alliances, the imperial ambitions, the family drama between kings, you're left with one single, unavoidable question. The assassination in Sarajevo might have been the match that lit the fuse, but the real tragedy is about who was forced to stand on that mountain of dynamite when it all went up in smoke.